Hi everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to part 3 of our 3-part webinar series on understanding tech abuse among young people. My name is Caitlin Pryor. I was a staff attorney and training supervisor at Day One for over 3 years, and I've been working with young people for nearly 15 years. So a little bit about Day One. For folks who haven't joined us before today, I invite you to watch the prior webinars on our YouTube channel, which will be sent out by NOAA after this webinar. But Day One is the only organization in New York State that devotes all of its resources to ending dating abuse, sexual assault, and the domestic sex trafficking of young people. And we think of young people as folks who are ages 24 and under. And we do so in what is a pretty comprehensive fashion. So we not only provide direct social and legal services to young people who are ages 24 and under and identify as survivors of violence and live in New York City, but we also engage in prevention services, so providing workshops from everyone from elementary up to college age children and young people on topics like consent, healthy relationships, tech abuse. We provide training, so webinars like you're listening to today, and also live trainings for folks who are working with young people, so they get the support to better serve young people. We're available to game plan if issues come up in your workplace and you want to talk it out, reach out to Day One. We have great materials for professionals and also for young people. You can order our guides from our website. They're called our Know Your Rights guides. And we also invest in youth leadership development. So we have folks who we've heard from during the past 2 webinars and who we will hear from today as well from the Youth Voices Network, who experience dating abuse as young people and are now activists lending their voice to this movement. So any requests for services, you can go on our website, which will be on the final slide of this training. Okay. For folks who have been here before, housekeeping is how we do things. So like I said, this is our 3rd and final webinar of our 3-part series. So yay. You will get an email today from NOAA, which will have the PDFs of all of the prezzies that have been used for this round of webinars. It will also include a feedback form for today's webinar. We're asking that folks, especially if you're looking for CEU credits, that you fill out those feedback forms. It will also have the materials. There will be a sheet on how to interview around tech that will be included, as well as a link to our YouTube page. You will be getting your CEU credits after today's webinar, so probably next week sometime from NOAA. I see a question on the chat box about CEU credits. You can directly ask NOAA, or NOAA will make sure to answer any questions you may have about CEU credits. If you can't see something, hear something, please let us know. Write it in the chat box. If I'm like super loud or super quiet, please say so. Any questions that you have are going to be answered at the end, but we ask that you write them in the chat box throughout the webinar so we can allot time accordingly. We will also be having a webinar series on sex trafficking that will be taking place in the next few months, so please be on the lookout for that. NOAA's email is here, and their email will also be on the final slide. Okay, so as you know, when our webinars are here to build off of each other. So I mentioned during our last webinar that today we're going to focus in greater detail on some emerging forms of tech abuse. So specifically focusing on spoofing, non-consensual pornography, and spyware, and talking through how to safety plan and screen accordingly for each of those forms of abuse. We're also going to be talking about how can we harness tech for safety today, so that we can use the good sides of tech as well. Okay, so a recap. So we're all on the same page as we're moving forward. So a reminder, young people are growing up with and through tech, and about 95% have smartphones or have access to smartphones. So if you're working with young people, then you should be working with tech and thinking about tech. Young people use tech for a bunch of really amazing reasons. It's important to remember that. It's also important to remember that identity may impact how they use tech and how important tech may be in their life, right? We spoke about LGBTQ young people specifically, and stats around how they're more out online or they're more likely to have friends online, or search for information about their sexuality or gender identity online. So we're reminded of all the great, wonderful ways that tech is used by young people. We know, unfortunately, that tech is also used to abuse, but most forms of tech abuse are simple, right? Not complex. I'm going to reiterate that a number of times today as we talk about the more emerging forms of tech. There are usually age-old tactics of abuse just happening through tech. A reminder that if we're working with young people, right, they have smartphones and they experience abuse, then we're screening for tech abuse. I have not had a single case of young people experiencing relationship violence that did not also experience tech abuse. We're using information. We talked last time about how to do a tech screening, right? Some questions. The materials that you're going to get today provides you some of those questions too that you could have in front of you when you're working with a young person. But we're using the information we gain through that tech screening and we're feeding it into our safety plan, right? We're figuring out how we can support survivors, and that safety plan should be made with the survivor, not determined by we, the service provider. We also, when we're thinking of a safety plan, we're going to remember that legal paths are options, right? So we want to continuously collect evidence. We're going to talk about that in greater detail today. However, legal paths are not the safety plan, right? We are looking to them to support the safety plan. They're not supplementing. And we are going to resist that urge, right? To be like, change your number, block everyone, go off social media. Because actually we could be making that young person less safe, right? We're resisting that fear-based safety planning, and we're going to be focusing on information and strength-based. And my hope is that with the information you gain, you feel more equipped to engage in this information strength-based versus the fear-based, which often comes from not knowing, right? I can't pinpoint what it is, so let's just shut it all down. So my hope is today will help to support that. Okay. So like I said, we are focusing today on the emerging forms of tech abuse, specifically spoofing, spyware, and non-consensual pornography. And we're reminded again that most forms are going to be simple. So even if we're seeing more extreme forms of abuse come out of things, so like we notice that the harm doer is stalking or seems to know everything, we're still not assuming it's complex, right? I want to keep that in mind. So the result or impact might feel very powerful and complex, but it could be a very simple form of tech abuse that's actually gaining the information to engage in this behavior. So I'm going to provide you some tools to be able to better hone in on what kind of tech abuse is happening and what level of risk is there. Okay, so let's focus on spoofing. So just a reminder, we talked about spoofing before. Spoofing is when a harm doer is impersonating someone else. So they may be impersonating the survivor, right? Or they may be impersonating a friend or family member of the survivor or someone who's providing a service, right? So it could be you all, a counselor that they're impersonating. It could be their attorney, right? It could be law enforcement that they're impersonating. And we know that spoofing can look like a couple different things, right? So it could be that fake social media profile that is set up that is either set up as the survivor or set up as someone else in an attempt to get information from a survivor. And maybe a fake email, right? We might not even notice. Maybe even one letter or number is off, but it looks like that friend or family member or attorney's email. Or it could be a fake phone call or a fake text. And really, when we think about what are the goals when you're spoofing, they can range. So the goal can be to gain information. That information may then be used to stalk someone or to humiliate someone. The goal can be to harass someone, right? Making them believe that someone they are close to is saying X, Y, and Z to them. The goal can be to engage third parties in their harassment. So I talked last time about a survivor I worked with that had their partner posted their phone number on Facebook, so set up a fake profile, and third parties were constantly reaching out to my client. So it can be to engage third parties. It can be to isolate them, right? to kind of ruin reputation relationships. We heard from a survivor last time that talked about her partner writing all this stuff on her Facebook account, right? As if she wrote it. And so sharing all this intimate information about her family and friends, you could see how that might ruin relationships, right? Further isolate someone. You may also be trying to impact something of importance. So maybe it's school, right? Sending an email as a professor saying the test was canceled. Maybe it's work saying, work is shut down today, or I don't need you till 2. Maybe it's a court case. So don't come to court and the order of protection is gotten rid of, or maybe it's the child care facility saying, oh, your mom already picked up your child and you don't do that. And so they use that against you in a custody case, right? So you can see how the goals can be pretty wide reaching. It's really easy when you're dealing with spoofing to think it's more complex, right? Because you're like, oh my gosh, how did they know I was here? How did they know that I said this to this person? They must be listening in on my phone calls, right? So it's really easy to think it's more invasive than it may be. And so we're going to kind of figure out as we go through this how to game plan accordingly. So what are some red flags? What are some things we should be listening to if we're working with a young person and taking seriously? And I really encourage you to kind of go beyond the whole like dog ate my homework way that we may approach young people sometimes, right? Young people are often not believed or they're thought to be exaggerating things. And so I really want you to remember that spoofing is real and to be listening for red flags, right? And not be basing things on these stereotypes of young people. And so some red flags may be that survivor that comes to you and says, oh my gosh, I didn't go to court because I got a phone call from you saying it was canceled, right? And you're like, I never called you, right? Or I never picked up the child because the daycare facility said that someone had already picked them up. And so that's something you want to investigate, right? You want to look into further. You're calling the daycare facility, being like, hey, did you ever call my client saying X, Y, and Z? So that can be a red flag. A red flag may be other people being like, why did you post this or send this to me, right? So in the case of the YVN member last week that talked about her partner posting on Facebook, her friend reached out and was like, hey, are you in your room? Like, did you do this? And so that can be a red flag. Another red flag could be the harm doer seems to know things that were conveyed either in an email or a direct message that you get on social media or a text or a phone call, right? So something you conveyed through tech, the harm doer now knows. Or they showed up somewhere based that you had conveyed through those methods. Also, we know that it could be a third party reaching out to a survivor about something that they never posted, right? So those are some of the red flags that we might be listening for when we're working with a survivor, and there's that possibility of spoofing. In this case, evidence is really key. So as we talk about particularly spyware and spoofing, evidence is really key when we're trying to figure out what's happening. So in this case, evidence is not as much about a legal case, although it can certainly be used in a legal case as well. It's more about connecting the dots. And so one of the things I find to be most effective is keeping an evidence and abuse log. So something happened and you're not sure how they gained the information, right? So like the harm doers showed up at the park and you're like, how did they obtain this information? Write it down and work backwards from there, right? So on this date at this time, they showed up. How did they obtain this information, right? Who did I convey this to? How did I convey this to them, right? And write that in the log because you want to connect the dots. You might want to reach out to folks. So in the instance I gave of the daycare that supposedly called to say that the child was already picked up, you want to reach out to that daycare and say, hey, did you ever reach out to me and say that the child was picked up by my mom? And if that wasn't the case, then that goes in the evidence and abuse log, right? Reached out to them, said they never called. You're trying to figure out then, did someone else call pretending to be them? Of course, you're thinking about maintaining evidence too. So screenshot, 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 like in everything. So screenshot things that show that. So if it was conveyed via text from the daycare, screenshot that. If there was a phone call that was from the daycare's phone number, screenshot that, right? Any email that you got that said class was canceled, screenshot that. Fake profiles, those can also be screenshotted. Now, if the survivor's in court, there's some additional methods that can be used to kind of like nail down what's going on. Generally around obtaining phone records if it's phone spoofing. But I don't want to get too deep into that. Just know that there are additional methods. One, if someone has money, unfortunately, right? So you can get computer experts and forensic examiners to help support that. And two, if you're in court and able to get a subpoena to be able to get records. But there's nothing wrong with just doing the basic, like connecting the dots evidence log. So how are we going to deal with this, right? So we're suspecting that it might be spoofing. We did the evidence log, and it seems that every time I text this person, they know where I am, right? Or it's just when I text that people gain this information about where I am, or the harm doer knows where I am. So we're starting to connect the dots. If we are thinking it's by phone, like a phone call, then a safety plan can be that you're always going to call back the person who allegedly called you. Because if you get a spoof call, you can call back that number and it will actually lead to the person that it was masked as. So if you get a call, it looks like your mom, you pick up, talk to someone who is pretending to be your mom. If you call back that number, it would be your mom's number. So you could speak to your mom and be like, hey, did you just call me, right? So you can call it back. Or you can always dig deeper. So when someone calls, texts, emails, you follow up with a question that only they would know. Or a secret code will always be said if they're really calling. So if I'm calling a client and there's been spoofing where someone has pretended to be me, I can always call and say banana, right? That's the code word. And so if I don't say banana, you're going to ask me some questions to figure out if I am who I say I am. A safety plan can also be to just be careful, right? So maybe if you're suspecting that someone's finding things out through your email, then you're not sharing personal information through email, right? You're calling that person when they email you, or you're using a different method that you don't believe has been spoofed. You're doing that working backwards, right? And with that working backwards, you're figuring out what else you shared, right? So if you're figuring out that the spoofing seems to happen through the text messages, okay, go through your text messages. Who else did you share information about where you were going, what you were doing, or any personal information? One method can also be to Google the survivor. So like in the cases of spoofing profiles, you want to find out what else is out there. So Google them, write it in that log, screenshot it, and then request that it be removed. Because the longer something's up there, the more impact there can be, right? So we're thinking about not only their physical safety, but their emotional safety if there's impact on relationships or career or education or reputation. We're trusting survivors, right? We're believing survivors. And one option can also be to record conversations, right? So that supports your evidence log where when I talk on the phone and say where I'm going, the harm doer shows up there. So you're recording the conversations in which you're sharing this information, and then you're able to connect the dots. I mentioned one option is a removal of spoofing sites. We talked about this last time, but just a reminder. So if it's a fake, say, Facebook profile, you're going to contact Facebook, say, hey, this is a duplicate false account. Take it down. I want you to flag this for the future. They're generally going to ask for some kind of ID, so keep that in mind. And advocate when folks don't have a government-issued ID, right? Particularly if you're working with young people or you're working with folks who are undocumented, they may not have that. So you need to be prepared to advocate. If it's on a Google-hosted site, right, so like YouTube, we're sending Google the URL and saying take it down. If it's not Google-hosted, we're doing those two steps, right? We're sending Google the URL saying, hey, hide this for me while I have it taken down. Then we're reaching out to the website and being like, hey, take that down. But screenshotting before we take down anything. And this is an example just of one of the spoofing apps, right? So you can easily look up spoofing and get an array of options. Some are largely free, some have very nominal costs. But you can see that SpoofCard offers options to record or go straight to voicemail, right? So you don't have to risk the encounter or the unveiling that might happen if you have a phone call. You can just leave your message. It also lets you change your voice and also change background noises, right? So it seems more legit. Spoof Tell is another option. And they have voice changing, they have text messaging options. And so just know that there are a lot of ways that you can spoof. And it's generally pretty easy to spoof through social media, right? You don't even need to like go through any applications. Okay, so that's about spoofing. We're going to kind of talk a little bit more about spoofing as we're talking about spyware because they can intersect a lot and spoofing can look like spyware. So this is not the last you heard of it. Let's move into spyware. So please, please, please do not see spyware everywhere, right? As we're moving into this. This is more complex form of abuse. It is a high risk form of abuse. And there are lots of alternative explanations for why things may seem like spyware, but are not spyware. So spyware is essentially an app that is installed on your phone or your computer that once it's installed, depending on the level of application or the package bought, can largely see anything going on in that device. So if you have spyware on someone's phone, you're generally able to listen to their phone calls. You're able to read their text messages, read their emails, look at their social media messages as they're coming on. You can actually turn on someone's GPS. And you can do things like get an alert when a survivor is in a certain area. So you can see how it would be high risk. For phones, you typically need to have physical access to the device. So that means that the harm doer needs to have had that phone in their hands and been able to get into the phone to download an app. It then masks itself as something else. For computers, you can do it remotely. So computers, that's when you get like the puppy picture or the link or the strange email that you don't recognize. Those are instances of spyware. And so thankfully for now, phones, you cannot do that remotely. You have to have it physically in your hand. So it's not as much a risk once folks have separated in a relationship, but you may not know it's on there until you've separated, right? It could have been put on at any point. Spyware is very difficult to detect. That is the point. It's supposed to disguise itself as something else. It therefore is very difficult to remove. And a lot of forms can just self-reinstall, right? So you may remove it, think you're good to go, and it can just kind of like replicate, right? Like a worm, it grows back. And so the goal is really to prevent it from ever happening in the first place, right? And we do so with our expanded passwords, so maybe two-step verification. We do so by talking to clients we're working with about not clicking on odd links or odd attachments or emails we don't know, having anti-spyware and malware up to date, and also talking to them about physical access, right? So limiting that physical access. And if they can't, then having passwords, right, that are not known to the harm doer. I'm sure there's questions out there like, how on earth can people just buy this stuff, right? Like, this is super creepy. And it's marketed towards parents and employers, right? So that's why people buy this stuff. That's why it's able to exist in this like super legit fashion. It's the idea that you want to monitor your teams, right? And monitor your employees and what they're doing. For the most part, spyware, I haven't found one that's free, so there are costs associated with, but I've actually found ones that are pretty inexpensive these days, which is scary. So one is mSpy, and you can get 3 months of that for $39.99, right? And the basic package covers most everything. So you can see their social media activity, you can see their where they are, you can listen to phone calls. So all the things I spoke about before are generally included in that basic package. Okay. So what are some signs that spyware might be happening, right? Some red flags that if you're talking with a survivor, you're one, listening for these things, and two, asking questions about these things. So one, a lot of these come from the idea that spyware is running on 2 devices, essentially. So it's not only running on the survivor's phone, but it's also simultaneously running on the harm doer's phone. So you can see how these things would result. So unusual battery drain. I mean, everyone has that right these days, right? So that's pretty hard to figure out. But if it's draining more quickly than usual. A battery that's always warm, even when you're not using it or not currently charging it, right? Again, it's working on 2 devices. The harm doer knows content. So content of phone calls, the names of the texts, right, as you have them in your phone, because they can actually see your contacts as they're listed. They're not just going to be seeing a number like you would see on a phone bill. And they know contents of emails, direct messages. It's detailed, right? When they called, what they called about, the entirety of the conversation, everywhere you're going. So it's very detailed. The phone, so the survivor's phone, takes longer to shut down than usual. You can talk to the phone company about whether there's been any data usage spike, because again, you're essentially on two devices. Unknown incoming calls are on the phone bill, where you're like, I'm not sure what this is. I mentioned before, they always know where they are, right? So that content, detailed information. And it's not just one method, right? So in spoofing, typically you might have it just spoofing through phone, so maybe phone calls and texts, but not spoofing through every other means, so direct messages, emails. If they seem to be knowing everything, so email, direct message, phone calls, text, then you might be thinking more towards spyware. Also, if they know information that was not shared through text. So some spyware applications allow you to remotely turn on a microphone so you can listen in on conversations that are not being had on the phone, but they're merely in the presence of the phone. So that can be a red flag. Stalking behavior. The abusive partner might allude to it. So oftentimes you kind of want to show your hand a little bit, because that's how you best provide fear. And so you may be alluding to it in ways, so to be thinking about that. They might also post pictures or videos that were taken surreptitiously. So they were taken not by the survivor, they were taken not during the course of the relationship. And so they could have been taken by the harm doer through the phone that has spyware, right? And so you can see how this would be a high safety risk. However, we're not seeing this everywhere, right? We're going to talk through a little bit, how do we figure out if this is spyware? But those are some of the red flags to be listening for and asking about. All right, how do we show spyware? So that handy dandy abuse evidence log, right? Starting with the incident and moving backwards, right? So if the harm doer says, why did you talk to Emily about this, right? So we include that as the first part, and we're moving backwards. How do we talk to Emily? Do we talk to Emily on the phone? Do we talk to Emily in person? Do we talk to Emily by text message? Do we talk to Emily by direct message, right? So we're trying to move backwards to figure that out. We can, of course, get records that show that data usage spike. We can record phone calls, right? So you start recording phone calls, unfortunately, with everyone, because if it seems like the partner seems to know the content of phone calls and show up or do things based on those phone calls, that's helping to connect the dots, right? Oh, when did I say that? Let me go back to my phone calls. I said that on this date. I said it through this method and to this person. We're taking screenshots of text messages that were sent, right, that they somehow know about. For folks who have money or involved in generally a criminal proceeding, an expert examination of the device can be an option. I haven't had that in family court, but family court does not have the means. Criminal proceedings will sometimes have forensic examination of that device to be able to say, hey, there is spyware. And also just reaching out to contacts, right, to see if that information, so you could start sharing fake information, right, making that phone call to try to test if they're going to show up where you say. So you can be testing that out. How do we safety plan? Well, first, we're not jumping to spyware. We're going to talk in a second about what are some of the questions we could be asking to discern if it's spyware or not. So we're going to take that step back, and we're going to try to assess what is the level of risk. And we're going to think about alternative explanations for why they may have certain information, right? So they may know the content of your social media or your email because they know your password to that social media account or to your email, or they know the password to your Facebook, and so therefore they know the password to your Instagram, right? And so that could be one method. Or it could be spoofing. So they know the content because maybe you posted something on social media and they set up a spoofing account pretending to be your best friend. And so your best friend can see what you posted on social media, right? You checked in here. And so that could be something too. It could also just be you have reduced privacy settings, right? So maybe you're sharing a location by checking in. Maybe you're sharing your location by posting a picture with something identifiable behind you. And so that could be how they're learning your location. Or it could be a third party posting those pictures, right? It doesn't have to be the survivor. They could also know your location because maybe they went into your phone, but maybe they did something more simple, like using Find My Friends and agreeing to share location so they can see everywhere you're going, right? Or because maybe you posted a picture to your blog and you still have the geotag on it, right? And so they're able to see where you took that picture by just clicking on that picture. They may know your location again because of passwords, being able to access your social media or your email. They could also know this information by just access to your phone bill, right? So knowing the password to your phone bill could mean that they're able to see who called you when, even if they don't know the exact name. We're going to hear a little bit from a survivor that talks about this form of tech abuse happening. And we can see how that could easily be thought of as something that they gained through spyware when it was actually a lower tech form of abuse. So what are some questions we can ask to narrow down what forms of tech abuse are happening, and with that help determine level of risk? So some questions I find really helpful when I'm trying to be like, what form of tech abuse is happening? One is, did that partner have physical access to your device, right? So at any point in the relationship or now, physical access to the device. And if so, do you have a password? And do they know your password, or could they easily guess your password, right? Because that's going to tell me whether they're able to have that device in their hand and download that app. I'm going to ask them about maybe some weird links or emails that came through, right? Reminding ourselves that it can be installed remotely for a computer. So if we're afraid of what's being shared through a computer, that can be a helpful question. We're asking about any children that they may have with their harm doer, and do their children have any devices, right? Because it could be something going on with their children's device. So the GPS could be set to on, right? They could be using Find My Friends on that child's device, or it could be spyware on that device, right? That is being used. But that can help us figure out where we're trying to devote our resources. We're going to ask them about passwords. Do they know any passwords? Is that a password for anything else, right? Are any of your accounts linked to each other, right? Which would explain why they're able to get into Instagram because they knew your Facebook password, right? Or whether they're able to get into Twitter because they're the same password as your Facebook and your Instagram. We're going to talk to them about privacy settings. So if I were to Google you as a stranger, what can I see, right? If someone was your friend, what can they see? Do you have any strange friend requests that have come as of late, right? To figure out if they're able to see it simply from being a friend on social media. We're going to talk about places or people that may have shared their information. So my workplace may unknowingly share where I am, right? They may have posted it on their social media. They may have posted it on their website, and perhaps they're able to obtain that information that way. And then we're going to ask about spoofing, right? So have you gotten any strange phone calls, texts, emails, messages where something might not be right, or where you conveyed this information, right? To see if instead it was someone pretending to be that person, or rather to be someone else, and that information was shared through that way, right? So that's going to help us kind of figure that out. And the sheet that you'll get after today's training provides questions, and then on the back it says what if they answer this way, what forms of tech abuse it can be. So hopefully to be able to narrow that down. So if there's spyware, what are the options? So if it's spyware, it is a high-risk situation, and it is a situation where getting a second device is likely necessary. And that second device should be a device that you're using for anything that is highly sensitive. If you are getting a second device, or if you know that there's spyware, you need to start altering how you use the infected device, right? So not using it at all will probably escalate things. It will show your hand. Altering it in a very obvious way may also escalate things. So it's important that the survivor work to do it as subtly as possible, even if it means sharing fake private information on that device so as to maintain the idea that they have no clue that they know that there's spyware. Reaching out to a computer expert to examine that device can be an option so that they can pinpoint what it is and hopefully they can know better if it would reinstall. Cleaning off the device in total, so not just cleaning it off and then putting everything that looks like it's not spyware back, because it could be anything, right? It disguises itself. So cleaning it off entirely and not putting anything back can be an option. And knowing that, like, even if you turn off your GPS, it can be turned on by the harm doer through their spyware app. So that's not necessarily going to help anything. Turning off the device could be an option. However, that may cause escalation, right? That could be a serious altering of how you're using the device. So you want to be thinking very critically about that. And so I want us to listen for a few minutes to a survivor that talks about their experience that was not spyware, but is something that they could have easily thought was spyware in some ways. So let's listen to that for a second.
He actually works at AT&T, and he could access my phone records. So towards the end of the relationship, when I had left him, I got a text from a high school guy friend, like a random one. And he was like, hey. And he was like, where are you? Like, what are you up to? And I was like, oh, I'm just at college. I was like, how are you? Like, I haven't talked to you in a really long time. And he was like, yeah. And he was like, some guy just called me and asked me if I knew you and asked, like, how I knew you and who I was. And he was like, I didn't really give him any information, but I just told him, like, I went to high school with you. And he was like, my automatic reaction was, like, something happened to you. Like, something was wrong. So he's like, I asked this guy, like, is she okay? Like, why are you asking me these questions? And he just hung up. And so I was like, that's weird. Like, I wonder who that was. And then, like, a couple hours later, I get a text from my ex basically telling me that I was, like, a whore and this and that because I was, like, texting and calling guys while he was, like, we were dating and all these things. And I was like, what are you talking about? And then I put two and two together. He had used his job to go into my cell phone records and probably my mom's too. And basically, I'm assuming seen the numbers that didn't look like my area code or didn't look like people I talked to regularly. So like my mom or my best friends. And I guess he was calling all those people to find out if they were men and then to question them about like who's sending to you to basically, in my opinion, I think he was just looking for any excuse to make me feel bad and looking for a way for him to say that I had cheated or I had done this, which I had never done. I freaked out because I think then it was no longer about me having to deal with the abuse. It was my mom. And for me, I was like, absolutely not. Like my mom's social security number is on her phone bill, right? Like her address is on her phone bill. Like all these things about her personal life are involved now. And then I was like, absolutely not. And I remember I was sitting in like the lobby or whatever it's called, like the lounge where you sit with like people, and my roommate again was there, and I was like, what do I do? And she's like, you have to call AT&T and you have to tell them what's going on because there has to be a way that they can help you with this. And so I remember calling AT&T. I was bawling my eyes out. I was crying. I called my mom first off, and I was like, turn off your phone, because I was like, turn off your phone. I don't want him accessing any information. And I called them, and I remember talking to some woman, and she was really helpful, but she was like, ma'am, like, I don't know what I can do for you. And I was like, just get your manager on the phone. I'll explain the whole situation. And so the manager actually came on the phone. I will give props to AT&T. Within 5 seconds, they removed his access from my account and put a specific passcode that only my mom and I knew. And the only way anyone who works at AT&T could get into our account is if they had typed in that password. So that was another thing that I, again, didn't realize that it was happening until after. But he did tell me, and he admitted to me, that the entire time we were together, he had been going through my phone records and looking and seeing who I was calling and who I was texting to make sure it wasn't like I was texting a random number at midnight or doing things like that. And including specifically at college. He was specifically checking like where those people lived and where the phone calls were coming from and what times they were coming in, which also was scary because like I didn't know what was happening. One, two, even if I had known it was happening, that's not normal. Like that's not good. It's my own private life, you know. And I think it's important for women who are in like serious relationships where you share this type of information to make sure you're somewhat protecting yourself, because I wasn't even sharing this information and I felt so violated. I can't imagine how a woman would feel if like they're sharing this information and then she finds out that her husband or partner or whatever is doing these things.
Okay, so we talked before about having access to a phone bill. In this case, it was a different experience because their partner actually worked for the phone company. But you can see how her partner could have made you kind of think there might be spyware, right? Calling and gaining information, calling and gaining names, relationships, gaining things like social security numbers or credit card numbers. It could easily, if that person hadn't called and let the survivor know that her partner called, if the partner was just kind of sharing that they knew this information or putting it somewhere, it's easy to think that this is something bigger, right? You have access to more than this. You must have access to maybe my banking accounts, right? You might have access to my contact list, right? So it could easily make you think it's something more blown up than what it actually is. And so to keep that in mind as you're screening for tech abuse, but specifically thinking about spyware. Okay, so let's move into talking about non-consensual pornography. Then we'll move into some safety and take any questions. So a reminder to be posting your questions in the chat box. Okay, so non-consensual pornography. So non-consensual pornography is when sexual videos or photos, and those videos or photos may have been shared willingly during a relationship or not. If those videos or photos are posted by a harm doer without the survivor's knowledge or consent. It includes the threat to share. So if you don't, I will. If you break up with me, I'll share. That can be known as sextortion. And it could be posted anywhere, right? Oftentimes I'm finding it on social media accounts or even porn websites. Typically survivors are hearing about this from someone else, right? Or the harm doer might tell them. The goal, as you can imagine, is really to humiliate, ruin their reputation, ruin the relationships, shame them, and harass them. It makes you feel like you're never safe. And it can happen at any time during a relationship. I don't find it happening as much during the relationship. I find a lot more sextortion happening then. But after they break up, it tends to be an escalation point, and so that's when it is often posted. However, I have worked with clients where it's been much later, right? It's been even months or years later. Of course, the goal when you're working with young people is to prevent if you can. Sexting is never entirely safe. That's just the reality when you're dealing with like the human element. However, it can be argued that sexting is a safer form of sex, right? So it's not a bad thing to do. It's developmentally appropriate, and adults do it too. So as much as you can engage in safer sexting, the better. But we're not shaming or blaming folks if they're not doing the things that we talk about under prevention. And so when we talk to young people, talk to them about whether the sharing of that sex feels consensual. A lot of times there's a lot of manipulation and guilt that may go into sharing a sext. And talk to them about trust, right? What they need in a relationship to share such an intimate thing. If they're going to sext, talk to them about things like not sharing their face, right? Tattoos, identifiable features on them, like a birthmark or background. If they're sending it from their computer, which is honestly less likely these days, you can actually delete before you send personal information, so information that links it back to you by deleting the exit metadata. So there's some descriptions there of how to do that. You can think about an implied nude, right? So not showing, not making it overtly sexual, but still sexy. You can talk to them about deleting copies, right? And not keeping those pictures in just their regular photo book, right? You want to be talking to them about maybe keeping them in some place like Photo Vault. We'll talk about that during safety a little bit. Or using, instead of sending from their phone number that has their actual phone number or from their actual social media account, sending it from a fake phone number, right? So that it's not immediately pulled back to them, or using an app like CoverMe to send the text, right? So it's not immediately identified as them. And finally, talk to them about community Wi-Fi, right? Reminder that when you're using community Wi-Fi, it might be vulnerable to other folks if you're not using a virtual private network. So as much as possible, not sending those texts over community Wi-Fi that could be accessed by someone who is not your partner. For non-consensual pornography, age really, really matters. The law has not caught up with technology, and so if you're working with young people and they are under 17 or they are dating someone under 17, tread very carefully because child pornography laws actually might be implicated, which seems ridiculous, right? When it's meant to protect young people, and going after young people for sending a picture of themselves or receiving a picture from another young person seems kind of ridiculous. But like I said, the law has not caught up. And it's actually a crime to make sexual photos if you're under 17. If you push someone else to, right, try to entice them to, if you possess them or send them. And it's largely in the discretion of law enforcement. So some law enforcement are not going to do anything about a young person who's sexed. Other law enforcement are going to use that young person as an example. And it's been happening across the country. And so it's something to really be thinking about. For young people, the law, there's no affirmative defense based on age. So what I mean by that is the fact that they are a young person sharing a picture of themselves and not a picture of like a child who's to be protected from an adult who's engaging in abuse, that doesn't matter, right? It does not matter that they're sending it to another young person. That will not save them. Less than 17, if you're less than 17, it's a crime to produce, direct, induce, or promote sexual photos. And if you're less than 16, it's a crime to be in possession, to produce, direct, induce, or promote. And it could be a felony, it could be sex offender status. So it's very serious when you're working with young people and they're sexting and they're 17 and under, or sorry, under 17 folks. New York City has a non-consensual pornography law, but young people really can't access it because they would be implicating themselves, and New York State is pushing for one as well. So when we're working with young people and they're under 17, some tips. Do not make copies. Do not place them on your devices. Tell young people not to send them to you. Talk to young people about the laws, right? Any evidence collection should be done on that young person's device, not on your device. The good thing about working with a young person who's under 17 and sexting is that if it's on a website, then you just tell the website, hey, the person is under 17. And believe me, they will move quickly to take that down, right? It's a federal crime. But what I tell folks is if you're thinking about going to the courts or going to police, tread carefully. You could bring child protective services and criminal justice system into that young person's life without even thinking about it. So really speak to community partners about whether folks in that community enforce these laws, hold young people accountable for sexting, because young people otherwise have a lot to lose. I worked with a young person who was 15 and shared pictures with their 17-year-old partner. And we had to talk about, they really wanted to go to family court and get an order of protection. And we had to talk about the fact that it could implicate them. And they ultimately decided to go, but we had to gather information first to figure out if it was safe. And it was certainly something I had to talk to my client about, right, to level that. I will say it was an excellent bargaining chip to be able to talk to the 17-year-old, now 18-year-old attorney and be like, hey, so they have pictures of a 15-year-old on their device that they posted. Right? So it helped to settle the case, but it could have gone much differently. So what do we do when there's non-consensual pornography? So we can take legal paths, like I mentioned, especially if someone is 17 and up, then there really aren't the risks involved unless their partner is under 17. We can reach out to the host's website and be like, hey, this is my property, copyright, take it down. That's only if the client took a picture. It's called a DMCA takedown, and I'm going to give you an example of that in a slide or two. But that's one simple way. We can do a reverse image search. So just like Google reverse image search, and then allows you to drag a picture into it, and it can look for other pictures like that to see if our client is anywhere else. We can also just Google their name, and we can flag their image and name for the future. If it's on a social media site, most of them have non-consensual pornography policies. And so if you reach out to them and say, hey, this is non-consensual pornography, I demand that it be taken down, they will take it down. If it's a Google hosted site and non-Google hosted site, right, same way to take down things as we talked about before. And I'm going to show you examples of that I've shown during prior webinars, just as for sample language as to what you might say. You don't need to be a lawyer to do these things. It can be the young person, or it can be a social worker, an advocate, anyone. But it is super labor intensive, right? It sometimes is taking down like 15 a day, because man, oh man, they can really spread. For a great example of how to take down things through any platforms, I encourage you to check out the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. They have like a step-by-step guide for most social media and websites, which is really great. And they also have a whole host of materials as well. So this is a sample DMCA takedown. So you can just Google DMCA takedown and send that sample language to a website. You don't need to be a lawyer to do so. This is a sample taking down a sexual picture from a non-Google hosted website. This is a sample, hey, hide this link while I take down this information. Okay. So let's listen to a survivor talk about their experience of non-consensual pornography.
Things were fine for a while, and then he had recently shown back up. He found my current boyfriend's like Snapchat or something and sent him like pictures of me or whatever, and my boyfriend was like, what in the world is this? And so at that time, like when that happened and when that came up, my anxiety was so crazy, like I was panicking. Now it's like I don't even know what to expect, you know. I thought like after 2 years everything would be over with, and because it was pictures and because it was on Snapchat, there was nothing I could really do about it, and I couldn't like hold him accountable or like press charges or anything like that. Like if someone sends you a message on Snapchat, you can only view it for the amount of seconds that they want you to view it for, and once the seconds are up, like the pictures disappear. When my boyfriend like received the pictures, it was on Snapchat and it was quick, and so he didn't take any screenshots, and so therefore there's no real proof that the pictures were ever sent. And like even if the pictures were sent, you know, there's not much that they can do. Like they couldn't go to my ex-boyfriend's house and be like, delete all these pictures or something. And we also don't even know like if he had the pictures on his phone. We don't know like if he sent them somewhere else or if he like has them saved somewhere else, you know. And so really like, is there any way of ever really getting rid of the pictures? No. I mean, in my head, I wanted it to be more like, if you ever post these like these pictures without consent or something, or post them anywhere, then then I can press charges, or at least something that like, you know, he can be held accountable for doing this, as opposed to him feeling like, well, if I send them on Snapchat or if I post it on Instagram and she doesn't know, or if I send it to people and she doesn't know, then I can get away with it and there's nothing she can really do.
So you can see that in this instance, one might think, oh, well, it's not that harmful, right? It was a few seconds, but it was sent to the survivor's current partner. And so, one, the impact of that is very clear for her. But two, it's also a struggle because you're like, what do I do from here? I can't prove this. And so oftentimes when it comes to non-consensual pornography, it is this idea of when will the other shoe drop, right? When will the next picture drop? And so there is kind of this hypervigilance that has to happen when you're dealing with non-consensual pornography. And so talking to survivors about occasionally Googling themselves, right? About alternate ways of screenshotting, using another device to screenshot so you don't get the notification on Snapchat that someone screenshotted, and just planning for the future, and occasionally doing that reverse image search. Okay, so let's move quickly into tech safety, and then we're going to wrap things up. And so let's think about how tech can be used for safety. And so I've mentioned a lot of these over the days. I'm going to highlight some that I find most important. The monitoring the partner's plans or moves is really important. I've had clients where their partner posts their every move, and also their every mood. So we know their state of mind and can safety plan accordingly. If you're still in a relationship and your partner has physical access to the device and you're using apps that your partner might be like, what is this about? Moving those apps a couple screens over, right? You actually have a good amount of screens on your phone. You just keep moving to the right. Or you kind of do the folder within folder within folder to hide that information. You can use tech to allow others to see where you are or what you're doing. I'm going to show you some ways that Uber is actually increasing its safety presence after all the sexual assaults that came out, to allow trusted folks to see where you are and to check in with you. You can use tech to send a code, right, that you're safe or unsafe, something you've determined beforehand. You can link devices. So you can have your text messages linked to maybe someone's tablet so they can see what's going on. The iPhone has a panic button, so you press it 5 times and it calls 911. You can allow certain apps to follow you. So Life360 lets folks follow you. Find My Friends lets folks follow you. Circle of 6 is another that lets folks follow you. And some of them also have some additional things that they offer. So Circle of 6 will provide an interruption, right? If you're in a date and you're not sure what's going to happen, you can get that interruption during the date, which can be helpful. And Life360 can let you message people and kind of give alerts to other folks. You can use Snapchat to send that destructible message. So while it's menacing for someone to send your naked picture by Snapchat, it can be helpful to use Snapchat to be like, hey, I got home safe, or I'm not doing well, so that the partner, if they're looking through your Snapchat, won't be able to see it. You can use disguise apps to keep information. So Keep Safe has a whole bunch of different disguise apps. They have a photo vault. They have one where you can browse discreetly. They have Unlisted, which lets you have like this burner number. They have app locks where you have to have a special code to get into apps. Tech can also be used to keep a safety plan or develop a safety plan. So My Plan offers that, which is really helpful. It can help you it asks you questions and helps to discern risk and decide next steps. So this is what I was talking about. Uber lets loved ones follow you on your rides, so you can allow trusted folks to be included on your ride, see where you started, where you stopped, and where you are. And they also, if something goes wrong, they can automatically share details with 911. So where you are, whose car you're in, license plate information, so stuff like that as well. And then this is one of those examples I said of the Keep Safe. They have their vault apps and they appear like something else. So this one appears like it's a calculator. And so it's actually holding maybe your sex or maybe all the evidence that you've been gathering. But it looks like a calculator, looks innocuous, so the partner won't notice things. And I really encourage folks to think creatively. Most forms of tech can be used for safety. They can be used to abuse, but they can also have alternative safety measures. And so to really be thinking about who you trust and who you would want to have access to those. So some takeaways as we wrap up and then move into next steps. Remember, most is simple. Most is not complex. Do not get hung up on spyware. Keep an abuse and evidence log so you can figure out what kind of abuse is actually happening. Connect those dots and determine the level of risk. When you're dealing with non-consensual pornography, be careful if someone is under 17. It doesn't mean they don't have options, but it does mean you have to tread carefully. think about the ways tech can be used for safety, and we're encouraging young people to do so, right? We're not pushing them to get offline. We are providing information, outlining their strengths, and we're not providing fear as much as we can. So I don't see any questions on the chat box. So a reminder, fill out your feedback forms. CEU will be provided after this webinar. If you have questions about that, please reach out to Noah. If you have a request for services or materials, please go on Day One's website. And the domestic sex trafficking webinar series, I write here November. It could be in the next couple of months, so just be on the lookout for any advertisements. So it will again be a 3-part webinar series on the intersection of dating abuse and domestic sex trafficking. But thank you all for all of your attention. This is our last webinar on tech abuse, and I hope that you have a wonderful afternoon. Be on the lookout for that email from Noah that will have the materials that I mentioned, the interview tip sheet, as well as the feedback form and recordings for this webinar, and links to all the PDFs of prior prezzies. Have a great afternoon.